All right. Welcome to what I guess is the last session of the day, but a very interesting one. The session's on managing aircraft noise, particularly on the ICAO balanced approach and its practical application. We'll be exploring what the ICAO balanced approach really is and how it fits into some of the key legislation, especially in Europe. There'll also be a discussion around the practical challenge that the industry is facing in managing noise. There's been a period of relative quiet during the COVID pandemic, and as the industry begins to recover, noise is very much rising on the agenda. And I'm very, very pleased to have a leading expert in the field join us today to present. Rick Norman from Heathrow Airport. Rick has over 25 years of experience working in aviation on various environmental issues, but with a focus on noise. He currently holds the position of Head of Noise Strategy for Heathrow Airport. But he's also led noise strategy and other initiatives at several other airports. He was the corporate head of noise and air quality for all BAA airports, where he led the delivery of the first round of EU noise action plans across 6 different UK airports. And before that, he was also working on ISO 14001 accreditation as the head of environment at Gatwick Airport. I can say that Rick is recognized internationally as a leading expert in this field, so I'm very happy that he's here today to share his thoughts on the ICAO balanced approach and noise issues more generally. So with that, over to you, Rick, and look forward to looking at your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. I certainly can't see you because I can see the presentation. So yeah, I'm going to spend a few minutes just going through my thoughts on the balanced approach, and also I'm sort of aware that not everybody will be as plugged into noise as I am. So I'll talk a little bit about that as a starter as well in terms of the background information. So just let me know if I'm assuming the slide has moved on. So what I'm going to cover this afternoon is a very brief outline about why noise is important. I'll give some overview of what the ICAO balanced approach is, some of the challenges we have, and sort of focus in on 2 particular issues there, some summary thoughts, and then kind of 3 asks of industry colleagues, really, things that I think are important for us as an industry to start pushing for. So I'll move on to that. So if we think about noise exposure and prolonged exposure at that, why is that important to us? Well, there's a wide body of evidence of an association between a number of poor health outcomes and aircraft noise exposure. In fact, that's true for transportation noise, just different levels for different transportation noise, but we all see those trends. Annoyance, sleep disturbance, children's learning, cardiovascular disease are all commonly cited as associated with noise exposure. That's not to say that there's total agreement amongst academics in terms of what the dose response should look like, and I'm sure some of your colleagues, if not yourselves, would have offered up views on the WHO guidelines that were issued fairly recently. But I think as an industry, we need to kind of address the fact that there is an association here. To dispute this is almost futile in this debate, and I think we need to sort of look at what can we do to mitigate these effects and improve the situation. So I think if we look at the policy framework within which the industry and in particular airports operate, we have a kind of global picture, we have a regional picture, and we have a national picture. So the ICAO balanced approach sits at the global level, setting out a framework by which we should all manage noise or look to manage noise. That often gets adopted into regional or continental legislation or regular policies. And in the case of Europe, that's Regulation 598 and the Environmental Noise Directive are particularly important. And then there's usually a range of state policies, legislation, maybe some local rules, some planning conditions, a whole bunch of stuff that operates at the national level. And just by way of illustration, I've just put up the Heathrow example just to sort of show how complex that can look. These are just a few of the things that we have to worry about in terms of managing noise at Heathrow, and you can see lots of different layers of legislation and national policy that come into the conversation every time we talk about aircraft noise. And that can be a challenge, particularly if you're an airline or an operator that's operating at multiple airports. Imagine this at the entire network. So the balanced approach offers a way of giving some sort of consistency to the framework of this. So what is the balanced approach? If we think about what that is about, it came about really as a proliferation of local policy was being developed. So about 2004 was when the guidance was developed. There was a little bit of conversation before that. But effectively, you've got a range of aircraft noise problems that had led to various operational limitations and opposition to airport expansions and constructions. Certainly at Heathrow, we've been more than experienced in that world in terms of delaying our own Terminal 5 development, and obviously our third runway proposals as well. And what you've seen to get is a kind of an uncoordinated policy development across the area of aircraft noise, and that hinders the kind of economic aspects of aviation that we want to see. So what you have is the approach is sort of aims to address noise problems at individual airports in an environmentally responsive way, but also economically responsible as well. Cost effectiveness is often the term that gets used around this. So how do we deliver the environmental outcomes that we want in the most cost-effective way? And that's a really important term to remember when thinking about the balanced approach. What we're looking for within the balanced approach is a sort of a flexible but consistent and transparent process for assessing what the noise objective should be, and then potentially what the alleviation measures or the interventions that we might make to manage noise might be. And it's that assessing noise objectives, which is another really important aspect of noise management that needs to be sort of considered. And then when we're selecting the measures and undertaking the analysis, some sort of consistency around doing that as well. So the economic assessment could be a cost-benefit analysis, but the usual requirement, certainly in the European legislation, is for a cost-effectiveness analysis. You can do cost benefit as well, but it's not a requirement. So, and you'll inevitably need a combination of measures to achieve the noise outcomes. And just on the right of the slide there that you can see is the sort of four aspects of the balanced approach. So you have looking to control noise at source, improving the operational procedures, so how the aircraft's flown. You have land use planning and mitigation, so that could be obviously not developing noise sensitive land uses close to airports, or offering noise insulation schemes for properties that already exist there. And then finally, not as a first resort, we can think about night restrictions. And the most obvious example of those that you'll see at many airports is some sort of night restriction on the operation. So if we think about that in the context of Heathrow, we have a kind of slightly unique situation where the government has designated us for noise purposes, which means that the Secretary of State is effectively responsible for our noise policy, and they put in place a number of measures as a result of that, and we have a responsibility for drafting a noise action plan to not only deliver those measures, but other improvements where we can as well, and we need to monitor against various procedures. If I look at the nighttime situation at Heathrow and the application of the balanced approach, the diagram on the right there that you can see sort of sets out the sort of stages that you go through in terms of developing the balanced approach. So what's the problem that you need to identify? In the case of night flights, that would be sleep disturbance, for example. What do we want to do about it? We need to set an objective. And the government has set an objective about limiting and reducing the number of people significantly affected. However, you might want to define that. And then you need to have some measures against that, whether that's what's called a noise envelope or a noise target type approach. And in the UK, we're asked to report on the size of our noise contour and the number of people inside of a particular noise contour. Interestingly, that contour doesn't relate to any sleep disturbance research, but there is a sleep disturbance calculation that's done through an economic assessment tool as well. I'll come back to that in a moment, but there are some key points that are missing from that aspect. But then you get to the balanced approach aspect, which is how to get there in this diagram here. So we set out a noise action plan, and within that we'll have some measures like noise charging differentials for nighttime operations. offering up a night noise insulation scheme for residents, operating continuous descent approach or rotating the runways round in a fixed pattern at night time. And obviously, there's also restrictions that the government put in place in terms of the number and type of aircraft that can operate between certain hours. So that all looks pretty straightforward. However, if you look at the data on that, over the last 30 years, I don't know whether I've been good, bad, or indifferent in terms of managing noise, because if I take the contours back to the start of the century, I might be able to show that actually we've had 30–40% improvement in sleep disturbance. But if I look perhaps over the last 10–15 years, that could be a 10% increase in sleep disturbance, or maybe a 35% reduction. Or if I just look over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been no change. So the problem we've got here is that the objective and the measures around it haven't been set, they haven't been baselined. And so the conversation that I have with stakeholders could be a mix of all three of those outcomes. Those that want to support the airport will talk about the 30–40% reduction. Those that want to oppose the airport activity will talk about the increase, or perhaps no change in that. And that's one of the real dilemmas that we've got in terms of managing noise. So I sort of summarize that in terms of two key issues that I see. One is that we've got this situation where, as an industry, we will quite often be waxing lyrical about the improvements that we've seen in aircraft. We'll talk about 70%, 80%, whatever number of percentage improvements that we've seen in aircraft noise. But against that, we see a backdrop of actually community response. The annoyance levels that we see in some studies is showing an increase. And equally, as I sort of hinted at from the earlier comments, in terms of the application of the balanced approach, I think there's two key things that are missing. One is that we don't really have a practiced or a diagnosed way of saying how do we know whether a noise problem exists. I asked someone in the EU what this might mean. Is it one person being exposed to a level above whatever threshold you want to term, or being sleep disturbed, however you want to define that, or not? Is it 1, 10, 100, 200,000? Don't know. So we've got no real sort of guidance on how to do that. And equally, you have noise abatement objectives, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a moment. But they tend to be, in my very technical term, woolly. So just thinking about this this sort of dilemma we've got in terms of a story of noise technology improving, yet we're not seeing the benefit coming through in terms of annoyance analysis that also comes out from most of the research that is published on this topic. What that tells me is that actually we need to be thinking differently about how we approach our noise management strategies. We can't rely on a story that talks about noise reduction in isolation. We need to think about how we're engaging with communities, how we're collaborating with them in some cases as well, how we are building up our relationship and reputation within our communities. It's really important stuff. Now, why is that important? It's because I don't think you can actually predict a level of annoyance from aircraft noise level. So what you'll see on the right hand side of the slide there is a whole bunch of studies that have been done in what we call dose response curves. Noise exposure level results in Y% of people being annoyed, and the lower graph there shows all the different studies and the points at which people were annoyed. And most of us would look at that and say, well, that doesn't really tell me anything. I could pick almost any number of studies and draw a line within that. And kind of what you see in terms of the graph above is where people have done that for 2 or 3 different sort of groups of studies. Other studies have also shown us that actually this noise aspect in terms of annoyance might only be 20–30% of the factors that shape that. Actually, the majority of that is down to non-acoustic factors. And what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean there are these factors, these sort of things here that inform how we feel about a sound level. Quite often when I'm doing lectures for students, I will run a scenario with them where I'll talk about their neighbour on their left-hand side having a party, and I'll just talk about that party and perhaps offer up various mitigations to having this party without mentioning sound level at all, what time the party might end, or any of that kind of stuff to start with. and ask people to keep their hand raised if they oppose the party. And a lot of people will put their hand down straight away. Some people will take several iterations of mitigation before they put their hand down. What that is telling us is that people have their view of their neighbour because of the relationship they have with them. They'll put their hand down straight away because they like their neighbour or they think they're going to get invited to the party. But it means that actually the sound level, the risk of annoyance is more than just that. So we need to be thinking in terms of aviation sector about how do we improve the perception of fairness, building up trust. How do we make sure that the money, the millions of pounds, millions of euros, millions of dollars that we're spending on insulation, for example, is actually delivering something that's valued? Is that really changing annoyance? There's no real research to say that has been a worthwhile investment. So we need to be driving more research to know that the interventions we make are effective and are changing some of those metrics that we get judged against. And so what we did at ACI Europe on a noise group that I chair, we also got together with a number of academics and tried to find some common ground about what we think the gaps are as far as noise management are concerned at the moment. And really the sort of, I'll give you a quick kind of 2-minute overview of this. There are some links in the paper about where you can read a bit more about this, but it's this idea of setting aviation within a broader context. So what we call it here is a kind of quality of life indicators or scorecard, but it's trying to position there. We recognize that there are some disadvantages, some harmful effects that come from an airport being adjacent to where people live, but there are some really good positive things that come from that as well. And I think if the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's the fact that actually people are starting to see the value of the airports in their regions. And, a number of people that have lost their jobs and the economic impacts for those regions is quite obvious. But we need to be thinking about that in a more kind of consistent way. I've mentioned earlier about the cost benefit effectiveness analysis. We have very few member states that will be publishing guidance on how to conduct that. We really need some consistency around that so we can get some good independent assessment of the interventions that we make and their effectiveness. And that kind of leads into the next sort of area here, which is around understanding all these different interventions that we make and putting a value on those. How do they adjust and change the annoyance or sleep disturbance? So things like respite is an issue that's discussed a lot in noise management. So that's providing periods of the day or night where people aren't getting overflown and have some sort of relief from the aircraft noise in a predictable way. What's that worth? People tell us it's important, but we can't put a value on it. We can't say that's worth 1 decibel in terms of the annoyance curve that I showed you earlier. And that's something that's really important. So we need to understand that, and these non-acoustic factors as well. How can we put some value on that? How could our relationship improve how people feel about us and the annoyance that we cause? And obviously communicating that is the final part of that story. So I just want to sort of pause on that point, that these are sort of fundamental issues that I think the balanced approach needs to start to think about. And what we've talked about in Heathrow certainly, and is increasingly part of other airports conversation as well, is that those 4 pillars I described in the balanced approach need to be supplemented with what I would describe as a 5th pillar, the community engagement and collaboration. Without doing that, the other 4 things don't have the weight that they need to have. So let's just talk a little bit more about the gaps that I see in terms of the process for application of the balanced approach. So as I said earlier, I think the bits that are really missing, what we have is this assumption within the balanced approach, and it's within the legislation, certainly in Europe on this as well, that the member states, the competent authorities responsible for setting objectives and identifying noise problems have done that work, and have done that work in some sort of consistent manner. I'm not aware of, well, actually I'm aware of one airport in Europe where there has been a sort of a set process, and they've set out how they've identified a noise problem, and they are currently going through the process of describing why they've got to the noise objective that they have. But they've had a conversation around that, and really importantly, the objective is more than just a simple statement. They've actually started to describe how they're measuring the success or progress against that objective as well. And that's really important, I think, to improve in the conversations that we have with stakeholders. It starts to give everybody an understanding of what are we driving for and where are we going. I think if we were to ask ourselves here now in terms of setting an objective, is there anybody in the room that doesn't think it would be a good idea to reduce the amount of people that have cardiovascular disease, or children's learning isn't harmed by aircraft noise, or reducing annoyance? It's really difficult to argue that those aren't good things to be doing. Where the debate comes is how quickly can we do it, how do we do it, and at what cost? And that's the bit that should be the debate, and that's where the balanced approach should come in. But agreeing what those objectives look like and starting to understand from a technical point of view what can be done over a particular time period is where we should be going. So as I see it, focusing on this objective is really important. And I think there's two types of objective in my view. One is a kind of statement that I would describe as visionary, tends to be something along the lines of, we want to remove the risk of sleep disturbance, or some such statement. It's kind of aspirational, there's no end date to it, and that kind of objective needs some sort of milestones along that journey towards total removal. It might never come, but it sets out an ambition of continual improvement. Other types of objectives might be more focused, so set around a particular time frame. So in that, taking the sleep disturbance example, you might say we want to reduce the population highly sleep disturbed by X% by 2030 compared with X date. That obviously needs to be reviewed regularly to be updated as you pass through that time phrase. What do we want the action, the objective to do? Well, it needs to set the level of ambition, and it needs to bring stakeholder interests together. And I think this is another area where we've come unstuck. So typically objectives will be sympathetic to one stakeholder group or another, and that leads to kind of political debate, lobbying, and all the rest of it that comes with that. Whereas actually I think if we start to develop objectives that have aspects within them that talk to all different stakeholders, there's more chance of actually getting buy-in from that wider group. You're always going to have people at the polar end of the debate that won't buy into that, but I think if you can build some consensus around what's needed from that. What's really important for me in talking about the objective is that it balances the opportunities for sustainable growth, i.e. gives us incentives within industry and opportunities to grow our businesses, and also balances the need to protect health of local residents. And that's almost the first line in the balanced approach regulation that sits within Europe. And it's a really important aspect and core expectation that I would have on that. But we need to be thinking about how do we set realistic outcomes. So again, within the legislation, we talk about having technical groups that can, set reasonable targets or expectations about how much change we might be able to deliver over what time frame. Again, this often gets overlooked and missed, and this just leads to frustration again from all stakeholders. Going back to my example earlier about the night flight piece, it would have been great if when the UK government wrote its nighttime objective, it set an expectation about what it might think we could deliver over a 20-year period. And then we'd know that if a 10%, 20% was a good score. I think the other aspect that I would sort of draw out from here is that we need to recognise in setting an objective that there are different stakeholder groups and different needs that need to be represented. So I would look to build an objective that kind of dealt with those different aspects, had a nod to all of those different stakeholders. So thinking about the statement itself, again, what tends to happen is that we only ever have that first element that's on your screen at the moment, i.e. some sort of opening statement. It may be visionary, it may be focused, but we have that statement, and then people have got to try and interpret it for themselves. I think we need to be framing these objectives in a way that people get a full meaning from it. So it might be text that explains what do we mean by, let's take the statement that we had around limit and where possible reduce the harmful effects. The second element of that might be explaining that actually what we mean by this is that the harmful effects are highly sleep disturbed, cardiovascular disease, annoyance, or whatever it might be, but we're being really clear about what that is. And then we need to be clear about how it's going to be measured. So we're going to use the WHO guidelines in terms of their dose response curve, or some national dose response curve, or whatever. But we're being really clear about how it's measured, and we might also be really clear about the caveats that we want to put on that measurement. So, for example, if I was setting this for Heathrow, I wouldn't want to have a variable population database that comes into that, uncertainty about which direction we might be operating more or less in one year to another because of the wind direction or the north and south runway utilization. You'd want to fix some components of that proposal to make sure you have a standardized approach to it. We need to set some expected outcomes. So if it is about sleep disturbance we're talking here, are we expecting numbers to increase, decrease, remain about the same over this time period? But we can set an outcome that people will judge us against. And there's a need, in my view, to have some sort of independent audit of the data that you're using to get the credibility and buy-in of that process. And equally, you need to be setting out, when are we going to be reviewing this? Within Europe, we have a noise action planning cycle of about 5 years. It could be a 5-year or a 10-year cycle as a way of doing that. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the sort of thing that I would be expecting to see within an objective. And one of the real challenges we have is that this isn't part of what we see at the moment. So I just want to give you a few kind of summary thoughts, I guess, in terms of noise management. So I think for me, there's kind of 10 points that I would focus on in terms of implementation of the balanced approach and thinking about noise management in general. One is that the competent authority responsible for those key objectives and the experts need to collaborate really closely, and that includes, airline operators and air traffic control and the airport itself as well. So we understand what is feasible, what is technically feasible in terms of setting these objectives. We need to get some buy-in and trust and support for the process. The only way we can do that is by establishing, as I've just gone through on the previous slide, some sort of structure and expectation around the objectives that we set, so they don't get seen as woolly statements or indeed interpreted in different ways by different stakeholders for their own purposes. We need to try and keep the objective as simple as possible in terms of how we describe that and measure it. Breaking it down into sort of bite-sized pieces for people is helpful. I think we absolutely need to consider the wider context. So what I was saying earlier about the quality of life conversation, we need to bring that into the objective setting and the sort of framing of the balanced approach in terms of recognizing that there are good economic, social and environmental impacts that can come from aviation, and that needs to be recognized in this. The objective and the structure within which we operate need to enable interventions and solutions that can be flexible. There isn't one size fits all for any state or any airport, and so they shouldn't be setting out solutions within the objective. So there's examples where somebody's set an objective and then said, and this includes a 6.5-hour night flight ban, for example. That's a solution to the objective that you're setting. That shouldn't be part of the story. I think we need to be honest about the unknowns where we know that there are uncertainties, particularly if you're setting an objective that's over the longer term. We need to be clear that there are things that will change over that time, and if we're upfront about that, that can build trust. I think setting objectives also helps, and us as an industry be more certain about what our future looks like and what we need to do to try and achieve the goals that we have as industry stakeholders in terms of growing our businesses. And we know that the investment that we make in new technology will be rewarded. So going back to the night noise example at Heathrow, for example, if I look at the improvements that we've seen in aircraft that operate at night there, 30-40% reduction in contour area for the period of the night time that we're most focused on, and there's not been a single movement added in the 25 years that I've been looking at night flights. So is that fair? Is that not fair? But that's a question. I think the next point is around the kind of skeletons piece. So I think if we're going to be respected in terms of our noise management regimes. We need to be open to having transparency of information and regular reporting of what we're doing, and that's the point of bringing in external audit of data that you use to get some confidence in what we're saying. And we also need to set expectations that actually change, particularly in aviation, is a long-term business. You don't change your aircraft as quickly as you change your car. And we need to be giving some sort of certainty to airlines and manufacturers about what the future might look like, so they can build and invest in technology that they know will have a decent lifespan. And finally, I think it's really important that we actually deliver on some of this stuff, and that's the whole point of having some numbers and some expectations about what it is we think we can deliver. As I say, I think we could have had a much more positive conversation in the UK about the value and effectiveness of our night flight regime if we'd had an expectation set about what that could deliver. And I think that's a really important aspect. So my final slide is just kind of three asks of you as industry colleagues, opportunities that you get. One is that we kind of push for greater clarity on noise abatement objectives that take account the need for both a sustainable air transport network and environmental protection. I think we should be pushing for that. I think we need to support and encourage more research that supports the positioning of aviation in a broader context and helps quantify the effectiveness of all the noise management interventions that we've invested in. My concern here is that we've just had a WHO review of kind of let's call it academic research, and there's virtually nothing in there about the interventions that have been made by industry over the years. Nothing on the sort of value of the how do we deal with these noise issues that we've got. And if we don't do something as industry, the next time this review goes on, it will be the same thing. We'll just see more studies about dose response relationships, and that graph I put up with all the dots of the various studies will just get denser. And the final request would be that you as airline operators engage and collaborate with airports and the competent authorities in developing approaches to the noise management, and that includes setting objectives. I think the more we can engage on this and bring a wider range of views into that, the better the objectives is going to be. So I'll just leave you with those thoughts, and I think there might be a few questions from now.
Thank you very much, Rick. That was very thought-provoking and insightful as well. I'd welcome anyone watching to send the questions via text. Haven't seen any yet, but I have some of my own. Very interested in this topic, and I guess I'll just start with one that's at the top of mind for myself and other industry colleagues at the moment. We've seen regulators across Europe start looking at noise, and in some cases aren't very familiar with the balanced approach itself. And in some of these cases, they jump straight to operating restrictions. And when we try to engage on the balanced approach, it's a difficult process to educate them on the necessity of setting a noise objective, identifying the noise issue, and looking at other measures before simply implementing a blunt operating restriction. Would you have any advice for industry colleagues on how to engage in these types of situations with regulators, given your experience?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, obviously, we're kind of in the midst of doing that in the UK right now. So, I think the first thing I would say is that certainly within the EU, Regulation 598 is really helpful. It's kind of setting out how to do that. But I think it absolutely goes back to this objective. So I'll give the example again of the recent night flight consultation in the UK, where the government was effectively consulting on its objective and also asking what measures we thought ought to be implemented in managing night noise. And the point that I was drawing out to them there was you can't have those two things at the same time. Until you've established what it is you want to achieve, how do you know what interventions you need to make to get it? So my advice would be to really push at that objective and get that nailed down and get that to a point where that's a reasonable expectation of what could be achieved over whatever time frame, whether it's a visionary one or a focused one, but you've got something that you can go at, because that's the only way you can get into the balanced approach. It can't happen unless you've got an objective. So I would really push that you've got a good objective to work from. And then you then need to look at the cost effectiveness tools that you have available to assess which measures need to come into place. And if it's a regulator driving that, ask them for the evidence that they've gone through and done a cost effectiveness assessment of the measures that are being proposed. That's effectively the questions that we would be asking of our regulator in the UK, and others across Europe will be doing the same thing. So it absolutely comes down to the objective as the starting point for this conversation for me, because you can't jump to restrictions without knowing what it is you're trying to achieve.
Fully agree. Switching pace a little bit. Actually, from my personal view, one of the most interesting parts of your presentation was on non-acoustic factors, and I hadn't even considered that myself before. But do you think that this increasing annoyance that some communities are more vocal about, in parallel to continuously improving aircraft noise performance over time, is somehow related to a fundamental shift in sort of the perception of aviation more generally? I mean, we've seen this sort of rise of anti-aviation on climate in Europe and some other regions. Do you see a linkage there? And is that somehow related to poor community engagement on our part? Or...
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognise in some of these studies, so what I kind of hinted at when I was talking about the increase that we've seen in annoyance, is that there's some debate around that. So there's a paper that I've put on the presentation there that kind of highlights the debate that was being had at WHO level around whether or not there has been a shift in community annoyance. But let's assume it has. I think it's reasonable to say that certainly community groups believe that we're more sensitive now, and they would point to the wrong metrics being used. So the increase in the number of aircraft has offset the improvements that we've seen in individual aircraft, would be the argument that would come through for people there. So I think there is something in that, and I think there is something in the fact that we as an industry haven't been particularly good at engaging with our communities and building up that network of support within the vast majority of people that are actually probably either neutral or might be mildly supportive of the airport. So what we end up with is a polar debate often, where there's us as great advocates for the industry against those that are great opponents of the industry. And actually the dialogue ought to be with the people in the middle of that. And if you don't get that support, then you struggle with that. And I would use the kind of Heathrow third runway debate over the years as an example of that. Not the current application, but the previous application suffered from just that kind of public debate that was being had, rather than engaging and motivating individuals that were quietly supportive of the proposal. So there's some efforts made to encourage them to join a group called Back Heathrow, that suddenly became a very kind of large organization that could lobby and influence the debate much more. So I think that sort of is where we need to be going, is accessing that and thinking about what are the things that are important to our communities. So the example I was giving about your neighbor, your relationship with your neighbor determines whether you like what they do or don't like what they do, and why wouldn't that be the same for us as an airport? So if we're doing the right things and building the right relationships with our community, for me, it seems an obvious link that would play through to how annoyed are they going to be by our noise exposure. It just makes a lot of logical sense to me. But it's a gap at the moment in terms of our understanding, and I would argue often our investment as an industry as well.
I think that brings us to the end of the session. But I'd like to thank you so much for your presentation and your time, Rick. It's been really thought-provoking, especially for me, and having to deal with this recently in some European airports. I believe that if any questions come up after you watch this, perhaps on demand, please feel free to reach out to Rick. If you have any specific noise questions, we'll provide the contact details, or to the IATA team, and we'll be happy to speak a bit more on this topic together. So thank you very, very much, Rick, for your time today. It's greatly appreciated, and hope to speak to you soon on this, because we could speak for hours, I think.
Yep.
Have a nice evening, and thank you very much again.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.